Hi folks, Matt Easton here, Scholar Gladiatoria. So this is really just a super quick video. As my regular viewers will know, I'm constantly collecting antique swords and I buy and sell. And so various new things come through my hands, some of which I haven't ever had before. And this is an example of such a thing. And it is a Highland officer's, what's known as a broadsword or claymore in the Victorian period. Essentially a basket-hilted double-edged sword. And there's just a couple of things I really want to say about this. First of all, this is a Victorian example, probably dates to between about 1870 and 1883-ish, based on the maker. This is it in its scabbard. Take it out of the scabbard, there we go. So the first thing to say about these Victorian basket hilts is, first of all, these were only carried by Highland officers. And in fact, sergeants in Highland regiments did have a simplified version of this as well. They tend to be a bit shorter. But if you were an officer in a Highland regiment, for example, the 93rd Highlanders, for example, then this is your regulation sword as an officer. Now, one of the things to mention about the Victorian examples is you'll notice, despite the fact they're called a broadsword, they're not particularly broad anymore. And quite simply, they're the same width as the officers' sabres in other regiments. So they vary between 1 inch wide and about 1 1/8 inch wide. I'm sorry, I'm going to use imperial measures because that's how those are the widths that were specified at the time in the Victorian period. And in actual fact, you know, the weight and the width and the length is very similar to a regulation infantry officer's sabre of the day. But of course, the big difference is you have a basket hilt. Okay, so the first thing to say is that Victorian era officers' broadswords aren't particularly broad. Okay, that's the first thing. The second thing to say about them is that the basket hilt is a style that essentially goes back to the 18th century, even debatably to the 17th century, and this was the traditional part. Okay, but the way that you must grip this is very much in what we would call a hammer fist or hammer grip. And you simply can't grip this style of sword like a sabre. I can't, even if I, really contort my hand and try to get my thumb up the back or try to hold it in a canted way, it just doesn't really work for me. I can sort of hold it in what's known as the handshake grip, but it's not super comfortable like that. Essentially, a form of hammer fist grip is what works with this basket. And in actual fact, some of these baskets are quite tight on the hand. This one actually fits me perfectly. Now you might be wondering, what is that red liner inside? Well, that is buff leather, okay, so you've got fairly thick resistant leather on the inside with a sort of velvet-like red covering on the outside to make it look pretty, essentially. Originally this would have had a tassel at the end, a decorative tassel, but that's since gone, unfortunately. Now, in terms of weight and balance and heft and all this kind of things, these Highland officers' broadswords really are not very different to the infantry officers' sabres of the day. You have more mass in the hilt, so the total weight is higher, but actually the point of balance is fairly close. It is closer to the hand, generally speaking, than the sabres are. The sabres normally balance about out there, and that is because what you've got is a blade that's about the same as the sabres, but a hilt that's heavier. So they are more hilt heavy. However, what you get for your the bang you get for your buck is essentially a much more protective handguard than you get with the sabre. And some officers, some writers on swordsmanship of the day really liked these basket hilts because they were so protective. But of course the downside is they're less versatile in terms of how you can hold the sword. And in terms of thrusting with them, yes, of course you can thrust with them. You can give 0.1 and 0.2 just as you can with a sabre. But giving a direct thrust forward is possible, but it's not particularly easy with these. However, some writers have said it's impossible to thrust properly with this style of hilt, and that's simply not true. Actually, I can switch to the handshake grip, and you'll notice I can now get the blade pretty much in a straight line with my forearm, so it is possible. Really, the last thing I want to say about this style of broadsword, I'll do a much more detailed video about this. This is incidentally the 1828 pattern Highland officers' broadsword. But the final thing I want to say about it is the word claymore. Now, most people talking about swords today, when you say claymore, you're thinking of a two-handed, mostly 16th, 17th century Highland sword with a very specific type of almost V-shaped crossguard. In the 18th and 19th centuries, the word claymore was adopted for this type of sword in some cases, and certainly in England by the 19th century, amongst Victorian writers, the word claymore was very often used to describe this, the basket-hilted broadsword. Okay, so the word claymore, some people go, oh, that's not a claymore, that's a claymore, that two-handed sword is a claymore. In actual fact, it depends when we're talking about and who we're talking about. For a Victorian officer, if you refer to a claymore, this is what they will think of. So there we go. I'll definitely do a lot more videos talking about basket hilts, because as I say, this is the first time I've actually had a genuine antique one of these, and there's some very interesting features of this sword to do with the blade and the hilt design, and indeed even the scabbard as well, that I'm sure you'll find interesting, and there are things that I can say about those, but I will put those into a future video. Cheers folks! Thank you for watching. Please subscribe, follow us on Facebook. You can buy t-shirts through Spreadshirt, support us on Patreon, or follow us on Pinterest. Thank you.